Welcome everyone to this conversation that I feel really grateful to be having with Dr. Marc Brackett, whom I discovered just last year, so fairly recently, given he's been doing his research for more than 20 years. Welcome, Marc. Thank you so much for being here with me.
Thank you for inviting me.
You are so welcome. It's our pleasure, and we are the lucky ones today to hear your wisdom from, as I said, the 20 years plus of research that you have been doing into the role of emotions in learning, creativity, relationships, health, and performance. And I know through this research, you have been the lead developer of a framework called Ruler, and also more recently an app, which I use, called the Mood Meter, and we'll perhaps talk a little bit about that. And also have most recently written and published this book, Permission to Feel, which I think, given the circumstances that we're in now with COVID and all of the chaos around the world, now more than ever, we do need permission to feel. And so I'd love to explore that with you today with some questions around the circumstance we're in, being COVID, and also diving a little bit into permission to feel in the workplace.
Sure.
So in New Zealand, you may or may not know, we had a relatively short but very sudden and very intense lockdown in March and April last year. We've had a couple of shorter ones since then. Literally today, as we're filming this, just coming out of a little short one. I know. And, you know, through this time, and particularly through that first really intense lockdown we had here, as you will have seen in your country and around the world, there's been a real mass outpouring of feelings. But one thing that I'm observing is that I feel that we're giving ourselves permission to express our opinions on our experiences. For example, I hate the uncertainty, or God, I miss my morning ritual of that coffee after I've dropped the kids off to school. But this isn't the same as permission to feel, is it?
Wow, you're going to make me think in this session. Well, I think what people are expressing is, you know, the underlying reasons for their feelings. They're not expressing their feelings themselves. And so, like, when I think about permission to feel, you know, the title of my book, I think about it in terms of the kind of this intersection of mindfulness about yourself and others, but with an element of caring. And so it's about being non-judgmental, supportive, open, validating, you know, of your own feelings, but also of other people's feelings. And so that's, like, to me, that's the first step, is just having that kind of mindset, right, around emotions, both your own and other people's. Then you can go deeper into, you know, what I call the emotion scientist versus the emotion judge about feelings. Right? Are you a curious explorer? Or are you a critical judge? And I think we've got a lot of critical judges, you know, and that both applies to self and other. Like during COVID, right? Like you were saying, I can't take it anymore. You know, I'm going to lose it. You know, this is killing me. And, you know, obviously this has been a really horrific experience for so many. But, right, you can be gentler with yourself and you can use better strategies.
You talk about, and of course we are talking about the word and the experience of emotions. Can you just tell us a little bit about the difference between emotions, feelings, and moods?
Sure. So think about emotions as being episodic. You know, think of them as being short-lived. They arise, you know, out of things that happen both in our thoughts, you know, and in our environment. So, you know, I was happy when I was not happy. I had a surprise 50th birthday party, which was, you know, just never would have expected that to happen. And I walked in, it was like, you know, like automatic, like they really got me. I was surprised. That's an emotion. And then, you know, I had feelings, you know, about my partner for doing the event, feelings about the people who were there, right? So those are more like our private experiences. They're around feelings or emotions, but they're more private experiences. So if you were really mean and cruel to me, right? Which you're not being, but I would like maybe be angry, like that's an injustice. Who does she think she is? Why is she talking to me so like that? And then I would feel like, gosh, I don't feel like being her friend. I don't feel like staying on this call. So it's like all the kind of stuff that goes around the emotion.
Yeah.
And then a mood can be the result of an emotion or a feeling, right? So, for example, I think a lot of us are in like chronic bad moods because of COVID, right? It's like, all right, I'm lonely. I need to get out of my house from working. And so, what I'm getting at here is that it starts off with an emotion like you're angry, and then all of a sudden you're like irritable for a long period of time.
Mm.
You know, it starts off with like, oh my God, like the sun is shining today. It's making me feel happy. And then you're just like kind of more positive and optimistic throughout the day.
Mm.
That's the mood.
Okay. And so mood, I guess emotions and our feelings about that and moods can absolutely kind of infiltrate and be absorbed by others. And I guess what's important, and perhaps why you've developed this mood meter app, is to articulate the emotion that's arisen, what we're feeling about it, and also to be able to recognize what mood we're in, and if there's that kind of emotional contagion around it.
Mhm.
And is this part of why you've developed this mood meter app, so that we can really articulate what's going on inside of us?
It is. I mean, so, the mood meter is just a simple tool, right? This 4-color box that is deceptively simple, right?
Yeah,
Just yellow, red, blue, and green.
yeah,
But each of the quadrants has depth.
yeah.
Yellow is high energy and pleasant. Yep. That's the green. So calm, content, tranquil, peaceful, relaxed. Yellow is happy, excited, elated, joyful, optimistic. Red is angry, irritated, but also frustrated and also overwhelmed and anxious and nervous. And blue is down, disappointed, hopeless, despair.
Mm.
I know the mood meter pretty well. And but that's just the first step, right? The first step is self-awareness, and also how are you feeling? I'm looking at your facial expressions, your body language, listening to your tone of voice, and I'm trying to infer, even though I don't know you that well,
Mm.
like how might you be feeling?
Mm.
And but you can't just stop there. I think a lot of people get lazy, like, okay, I checked in on the mood meter, but now it's like, all right, well, do you know why you're feeling that way?
Mm.
What might have caused you to have that feeling? And
Mm.
do you really know what the feeling is? Because once you start thinking about the reason for your feeling, you start realizing, well, maybe I'm not frustrated. Maybe I'm actually disappointed.
Mm.
Or maybe I'm not angry. I'm overwhelmed.
Mm.
Because all of these feelings or emotions have different underlying reasons.
Mm.
Anger is about injustice, and disappointment is about unmet expectations.
Mm.
And then so now you've gone through like what I call the R, the U, and the L. You've kind of identified what quadrant, why you're there in the label.
So that's
And then
the
you've got to decide, okay,
recognize, the understand, and the labeling, the R, the U,
correct.
and the L. Yeah.
Mhm. And then the E and the R are what we do with those feelings. So, like, do I feel comfortable expressing my true feelings with you?
Mm.
That's a factor, isn't it?
Yeah.
Um, do I know how to express my feelings? Have I been taught? And then regulating, like, all right, so I'm angry. How do I express it? And then how do I deal with my own anger? Like, how do I modulate my anger?
Mm.
And
Mm.
so that's where the model comes to play, which is R, U, and L are about being self and other aware.
Mhm.
And then the E and the R are what are the things that we do to support ourselves in dealing with our feelings and helping other people to deal with theirs.
Mm. Which is so important always. But right now, I've noted that the World Health Organization has categorized burnout as an occupational phenomenon post-COVID. Now, I know
Mhm.
it was absolutely
Mhm.
around pre-COVID, but now it's this categorized occupational phenomenon. And
Yeah.
there's another book that's just been put out, you may have seen, called Burnout by
Yeah.
Amelia Nagoski. And I'm reading that, and what I find fascinating is that they describe the first stage of burnout as emotional exhaustion. And I
Yeah.
can really relate to that, because through COVID last year in New Zealand, for me, I was producing so much content, and there was a lot of need for support with re-engagement and mental and emotional health. And that's the space that I work in. So for me, there was a lot of giving, emotional giving of myself last year. And I did find at the end of the year, I just felt quite fatigued.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, from your perspective, the relationship between permission to feel and that the regulation, and the
Mhm.
allowing yourself to process emotions and self-regulate so that we don't reach burnout. What are your thoughts or your wisdom on that?
Yeah, it's a big one. Because it's, again, you're asking big questions, but they're good ones because A is sometimes you are legitimately burnt out.
Yeah.
And let's just recognize that. Like if you are a first responder, if you are a
Mm,
nurse or a doctor, who is in the ER dealing with people who have COVID, like you're just there's so many demands, and it's just pulling on you.
mm,
Now, what employers need to do, in my opinion, right, is recognize that early on
mm,
and make sure that people's shifts are, not as long as they might need to be, or yeah, no, they're giving people the space to take more breaks,
mm,
making sure that people have opportunities to debrief,
mm,
right, their stress levels. Years ago, I did this work in a casino, actually, where the dealers were all just burnt out, and they were actually becoming, there's a lot of alcoholism.
mm.
And I asked them, so what is your strategy? Because when you think about it, when you are like working in a casino, your clients are not necessarily the nicest people,
Yeah.
right? They're people who are drunk, who are losing their money. Like that is not fun.
Yeah.
And so when you're faced with that all the time, just like in a very different vein, as a doctor working with a patient who is severely ill, like it's hard,
Mm,
and it's taxing on your psychological system.
mm,
So the question that I have for employers are, like, what are you doing to support people to have greater well-being? Are
mm,
you giving that space to decompress? Do they have a talking partner, a buddy with whom they can speak about? Are you doing some exercise and mindfulness or meditation?
mm,
Are you giving them good nutrition?
mm,
And and so permission to feel, I actually believe that if leaders of organizations understood the principles of giving people the permission to feel, and
mm,
were emotion scientists as opposed to emotion judges, right, we would have less burnout because we would
mm,
create systems and structures
mm.
that would be aligned with well-being as opposed to generating burnout.
Mm. Absolutely. And it really makes me think, when you talk about workplace and businesses and leaders, another piece of research that came out through our first kind of COVID installment last year was from the Gallup organization. And it was that the 4 qualities that people look for in leaders in times of challenge and change are compassion, trust, stability, and hope. And I think, where you're talking about recognizing people's feelings, being that emotional scientist, not just for yourself, but for people in your team, and giving them the space, not just to be able to express, but actually to be able to understand themselves first. I think, to me, that speaks of compassion. And obviously you need to have a trusting environment for that to happen. But I think there's quite a linkage, isn't there, between permission to feel and that quality of compassion.
Definitely. I think when you think about these words, compassion, trust, stability, and hope, I think that we have to go into, okay, so what are the underlying skills of the individuals in order to create environments or to create these
Mm,
characteristics?
mm,
And so when you think about compassion, right, if you can't read people well and you're not interested in how people feel, it's hard to be compassionate.
mm,
Just, if you don't recognize that hope is a valuable concept, and you don't believe that it will increase productivity
mm,
and that it will help people feel, trusted and et cetera. If you don't have that kind of knowledge, and understanding you're probably not going to do things
Mm.
to create that hope.
Mm. Yeah. It's so true. And what you're talking about there is again an example of being an emotional scientist, or in this case, a scientist of the qualities that have been articulated that are so important. What does it really mean? What are the skills? And also I would say, when you recognize what the skills are, then pair them or match them to, if these are the skills required for these qualities, what are the natural talents or strengths that I have that actually relate to, or I can aim
Yeah.
towards growing those skills and being more of that kind of a leader, um, which is my background as a Gallup Strengths coach. On that point, emotional scientist, which is being a curious explorer, you said, didn't you, of our own and others' emotions. I think that takes courage to do that, to give people the space and have that open receptivity to receive whatever it is that particularly your colleagues or teammates might need to, or maybe it's not so much a need to, but a desire to express. But in my experience, the businesses that I've worked with, not all of them, but many of them, there's a resistance to integrating what I call practices of the heart. This is about being compassionate. It is about, intimacy in terms of people's emotions. So why is it so hard to talk about emotions at work?
Yeah, it's something that I think about all of the time, because I have noticed, even during these difficult times, I think um, the factor of vulnerability,
Yeah.
right? That if I share, like, I'm the director of the Center for Emotional Intelligence, and if I share that I'm anxious and overwhelmed, oh my God, how are we going to function as an organization if the director is anxious and overwhelmed?
Yeah.
And so I think that, firstly, the assumption there is that anxiety and being overwhelmed are bad emotions.
Mm.
But there's no
Which is
such
where that
thing.
judgment comes in that you were talking
Exactly.
about.
From my perspective, there's no such thing as a good or a bad emotion.
Mm.
They're emotions or experiences that come for legitimate reasons. Like, I always tell people, they say, "Are you anxious about, the coronavirus?" I'm like, "Yeah, like we could die." So, like, there's good reason to be anxious. But the point is, do I have strategies? I do. I apply all the social distancing rules, the masking, and et cetera.
Mm.
And I also don't put myself in situations where I'm going to be at risk. And
Mm.
so, then you have less to be anxious about. I'm like, pretty much.
Mm.
Yeah. And so, again, even as a leader, I think what's most important is that you be honest with people about your feelings, but even more importantly, you share with people the helpful strategies that you're using to manage your feelings.
Mm.
As a matter of fact, we did a study recently that confirms this is true. So we did a large study, and what we did was we looked at the emotionally intelligent behavior of the leader from an intra and interpersonal level. So, like, Mark is good at handling his own feelings of stress and overwhelm versus Mark is good at supporting, for example, you in dealing with your feelings. So there's interpersonal components. And then we asked people about, well, how do you feel at work? What's your burnout levels, et cetera? And what we found was, as you might predict, when the leader had more emotionally intelligent skills, people were happier, they were less burnout, they were less likely to want to leave their profession, they were more inspired every day at work. But during COVID, we found something even more interesting, which was that if you were someone who was deeply affected by COVID, either yourself or someone that you cared for, when you worked for someone who was a leader that was higher versus lower in emotional intelligence, you were significantly less burned out.
Wow.
And so it just shows you, right, that people who lead, who have these skills, create environments where their employees feel nurtured, where they feel valued, where they feel appreciated, and where they can be their true selves.
Mm. I love that. I love, yeah, the conversation about being your true self and, being authentic. It's about authentic leadership, which is so important. And I love this wee passage from your book that I'll just read out. When we express our emotions, we're saying, here's what I feel and why. Here's what I want to happen next. Here's what I need from you right now. It's probably as intimate as we'll ever be, which is why you've referenced the fact that it is vulnerable. But if we can have honesty, then what happens is we start to engender that trust between each other. We start to build, therefore, an environment and a culture of trust, and therefore stability and hope. I think, those things interlink so beautifully. So I suppose my final question for you, just in respect and recognition of your time, because I know we don't have too much time left, is for businesses and teams that really want to embrace permission to feel, what are the first and most important steps, practical steps, for creating an environment that welcomes and also being a leader who really attends to the feelings of their people?
I think, firstly, it goes back to being aware of your own feelings, right, as a leader, and also just being honest with yourself. Do you give yourself the permission to feel?
Mm.
Are you a leader that people feel safe and comfortable with talking about their feelings? And so that's just one big piece of it. And just that's kind of the introspection that leaders have to go through.
Mm.
Then you have to commit to being the emotion scientist and not the emotion judge. Like, watch yourself. Am I immediately judging when someone comes into my office upset that, oh, they're angry, for this reason? Or am I curious about why they're having their feelings? And am I open to listening?
Mm.
Then you got to work on the skills. I mean, you really do. Like this emotion language piece. I'll give you an example. I've done like hundreds of talks over the last 6 months for leaders. I'm exaggerating, but I've done like 50. And I always ask people, what's the psychological difference between stressed, overwhelmed, um, anxious, and under pressure? And most people say nothing. I say nothing. Well, it's not a trick question, right? And so, without getting into too much detail, like being stressed is having too many demands and not enough resources. Being anxious is uncertainty about the future. Being overwhelmed is feeling you're just overcome by your feelings and don't know how to escape. And I'll just stop there. And so I say to them, do you think that knowing those differences matters? Oh, maybe. Well, why? And then we finally come to the resolution that, well, the strategies that you would use to support yourself and other people in managing those three related nothing difference emotions are quite different.
Mm.
And so that's the kind of knowledge and skill that I think every leader needs to develop. The last thing I'll say, just because of time, is that oftentimes we know how people feel at work because they yell, scream, they pout, they roll their eyes in meetings. But I would recommend that everybody does something different, which is find out how people want to feel.
Mm.
And so we call that ideal affect in the psychological literature.
Mm-hmm.
And so, for example, I do a lot of work in education. And I asked teachers over the summer, thousands of them, how do you want to feel in the beginning of the school year? And they all said excited and appreciated. So I shared that with leaders of schools. And I said, well, what are you doing? They've been in quarantine. They feel like they're not effective working from home. What can we do as leaders to support our teams in feeling both excitement and appreciation, knowing that they're going to still be anxious? But the truth is you can have, right, we're complicated people. We can be both anxious, excited, and overwhelmed.
Yeah.
And we can also, want to feel appreciated when we feel angry and scared.
Mm.
And so my point here really is just do an interesting poll and ask people, what are the top 3 feelings that you want to have working in this office?
Yeah.
And then once you kind of aggregate all those data and you see the top 3 or 4 or 5, you might go to the next level, which is, okay, well, what are we going to do together in order to create those feeling states at work each day?
Mm.
And I think that takes courage.
Mm.
But as I say to all of the business leaders that I work with, no one leaves their emotions at the door.
Yeah.
We experience emotions from the moment we wake up in the morning to the time we go to bed at night.
Mm.
And when we're in a meeting, we're in the boardroom, people have feelings. And so let's just acknowledge that they are there and use them wisely
Mm.
as opposed to destructively.
Ah, You can't even know how much I love that, because one of the things that I also do, as well as the strengths coaching, is desire mapping. And the question with that, the ultimate question is, how do you want to feel? And,
Great.
what is your desired feeling? So I do use that in my work. And I just think, what you've talked about there is, well, you've validated it, but from a science perspective, it's not just about how you're feeling now, it's how you want to feel, and then kind of creating a pathway towards those ideal feelings, which is a much more hopeful, optimistic way of
It
being,
is.
especially in this uncertain time.
I couldn't agree more.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
I mean, I could talk for a lot longer. There's a lot more questions I would love to ask you, but I really
Well,
appreciate
we can
the time
revisit
that
again in a
you've
couple of
given.
months if you like.
Amazing. Thank you so much, and
Thank
have
you.
a wonderful day, whatever time it is there in your end or edge of the world.
Thank you. And let me just tell everybody that I hereby grant them permission to feel all emotions, and I send over the magic dust to New Zealand.
Amazing. Thank you so much.